Good morning and most welcome to 1364 of the Heidegger series. I will continue the path taken earlier on with Stephen M. Rosen's article Quantum Gravity and Taoist Cosmology. A coherent system is a weak system. I subtitled this, and this is how non-contradiction and rules of rational thinking does not even make sense. It's the weakening tendencies, whereas what seemingly being contradictory is enforcing thinking, enforcing wholeness. And we spoke about whole with two different spellings, whole with a W or without a W. And from the whole in the Klein bottle, there's also the Klein bottle's wholeness. That's a completely different and more encompassing view of what space can allow and what space potentiates. And I left up at page 11. I'm starting with the second paragraph. There will be a link for you to follow my read in the description on the YouTube channel. Now recall our association of the Klein bottle with a microphysical spinning action that lies at the heart of quantum mechanics. This points to the dynamic character of the Kleinian configuration. When it is understood in the micro-world context. Here, more than a fixed structure, it is an action, a psychophysical atom of process. And when we remember the correlation of Kleinian topology with the hypernumber epsilon, what comes to mind are the archetypal numbers. Of the Hutu described by von Franz. For as noted earlier, such numbers are psychophysical patterns of motion. And each number is thought of as containing a specific activity that streams forth like a field of force. But how specific is the correspondence between the dynamic structure of the Hutu number fields and that of the Klein bottle? In the previous section, we found that the Hutu consists of a double cycle of numbers. With each number embodying a rhythmic action onto itself. Very important, it's to itself. An internal phase of transformation, as von Franz termed it. The first cycle contains 4 such phases. This is followed by a return to center. After which we enter the second cycle of 4 phases. Here the forward or clockwise orientation of the number rhythms in cycle 1. Has been reversed, with phases now being characterized as having a backward or retrograde action. And whereas the first 4 inner rhythms are physical, the second 4 are psychic. Are we to take these 2 cycles as related in a merely sequential fashion? When the second cycle is enacted, is the first cycle simply left behind. Which would suggest that the cycles are essentially external to each other. It seems that von Franz cannot be suggesting this in view of her emphasis on the thoroughly psychophysical nature of the Hutu number field. At one point, she asserts that number is bound up with a latent material aspect of the psyche and with a latent psychic aspect of matter. Somehow then, latent within the physical circulation of the whole two, cycle 1 is an aspect of the psychical circulation, cycle 2, and vice versa. Von Franz offers an enigmatic clue for the interconnection of psyche and matter in her discussion of a related mandala. The double wheel of Ezekiel, wherein two wheels are depicted as intersecting each other at right angles. The wheels, says von Franz, do not work in unison, but are contiguous at the center, which is a technical impossibility. The two systems are incommensurable. commenting further, she notes that the mysterious point of contact between the two systems appears to be the center, or a sort of pivot where psyche and matter meet. But the iconic image of Ezekiel's wheels does not in itself effectively indicate the mutual latency of psyche and matter. Since the wheels are shown as separate, except for the aforementioned point of contact. If the images of the Hutu and Ezekiel's wheels express the intimate relationship between psyche and matter in merely abstract symbolic terms, is there a deeper, more concretely embodied way of delivering this conjunction? I submit that the hidden topology of the Hutu is none other than that of the Klein bottle. To confirm this, we begin by working with the lower dimensional counterpart of the Klein bottle, the Möbius strip. Let us compare the curiously configured Möbius with its more conventional analogue, a cylindrical ring. The ordinary ring 5A is constructed by cutting out a narrow strip of paper and joining the ends. To produce the surface of Möbius, give one end of the paper strip a half twist before linking it with the other. Now imagine yourself circling about the cylindrical ring. Position on the inner surface of this two-sided structure. You move 360 degrees around to complete one inside. To complete one revolution, sorry. Returning to your point of departure. Naturally, your passage around the inside of the ring never takes you to the outside. Throughout the journey, you remain on the side on which you began. It is not like this, with movement around the one-sided Möbius surface. While 360 degrees of revolution do seem to bring you back to your point of origin. At the same time, it is not your point of origin. Since you are now on the other side of the surface, notice the way ordinary circular revolution maintains the simple dichotomy between point of origin and displacement from that point. by 180 degrees of movement on the cylindrical ring. You are furthest removed from where you began. And by 360 degrees, you are back where you started. And displacement from that point by 180 degrees of movement on the cylindrical ring. You are furthest removed from where you began. And by 360 degrees, you are back where you started. The displacement being simply and completely reversed. On the other hand, with 360 degrees of Möbius revolution, there is a circling back to the point of origin that is at once the point most removed from the sad origin. Since one-sidedness is taken into account, it is the point on the other side of the surface that is diametrically opposed to the starting point. What happens if you continue revolving beyond this 360-degree point of quasi-return? After an additional 360 degrees, you find that you have now truly returned. Since you have come back to your point of departure on the same side of the surface from which you first set out. And my comment, this is also to do with the elementary particles and the world around us. For an electron particle to do a spin, it needs to go 2 turns. This is the odd spin. The same also applies for a thought, as David Bradel showed. For the cerebellum to complete its action, it must always return to the sender, thereby making 2 complete revolutions. To be compared to the Aristotelian condition of 1 linear route in a conclusion. And no comment. Consider the general resemblance of Möbius action to the action pattern of the Who-2. Both are double cycles involving an initial return to the origin. Followed by a second circuit that repeats the process, now completing it in earnest with a second return to the origin, which is the Who-2 phase 10, back to where it started. However, instead of showing the Who-2 as consisting simply of separate cycles connected by a separate, thus external intercyclical linking phase, phase 5. The one-sidedness of the Möbius superimposes the cycles upon each other, concretely conveying the paradox that these 2 circulations the physical and the psychical also are one. We can say that the cycles of the Möbius are so intimately entwined that the transition to cycle 2, the new cycle, is just as much a literal repetition of the same cycle. A related feature excuse me, of the Möbius strip further confirms its intimate correspondence with the who too. For the latter, we have found that whereas cycle 1 entails clockwise movement, cycle 2 is counterclockwise. A shift in clock sense is just what takes place in revolving around the Möbius. Through the manner of transformation is more subtle than a simple association of one cycle with clockwise action and the other with counter-clockwise action. To demonstrate this property, I incorporate a test body into the model, a face in profile, figure 6. It's depicted on page 14. Figure 6. Revolution of left-facing profile of cylindrical ring A. And on Möbius strip B. Figure 6a shows a left-facing profile revolving in a counterclockwise direction around a cylindrical ring. It is clear that action on the simple ring will continue indefinitely in this manner. With the orientation of the profile never changing. In figure 6b, we see the profile moving counterclockwise about the Möbius strip. entering the twist, the left-facing form is changed into its right-facing counterpart. The transformation being completed after 360 degrees have been traversed. The transformation of left into right therefore coincides with the occurrence of one full cycle of Möbius action. This change in orientation can be seen to reflect a change in clock sense. For what is counterclockwise to a left-facing profile will be clockwise to one that faces right. Thus, like the action of the Who-2, Möbius action involves a reversal of clock sense. However, the structure of the Möbius reveals a process of orientation reversal that is more nuanced than what von Franz's text indicates for the Who-2. With a Möbius, it is obvious that cycle 1 action is not uniformly clockwise from beginning to end. This being followed by a shift in gears that gives a second purely counterclockwise cycle. Rather, the clockwise orientation of cycle 1 is fully realized only at the end of the cycle as the culmination of an ongoing transformation from an initial counterclockwise orientation. Then, in entering cycle 2, the direction of the gear shift has itself shifted so that the momentum is now from clockwise to counterclockwise. The fact that change in clock sense is inherent to Möbius action means that no separate switching of gears is required to bring it about. The gears are shifting throughout each cycle. With a quasi-return to the origin marking the completion of the shift in one direction. And the readiness to begin shifting in the other. The broader implications of these transformations of clock sense will soon be discussed. This reminds me from the master and his emissary. The left hemisphere linear thinking is always incomplete. It doesn't have a conclusion. Sometimes this is referred to as fragmented thinking or non-conclusive thinking. The left hemisphere itself does not understand neither beginning nor conclusion, therefore cannot start a reasoning and not end a reasoning. Both those maneuvers takes a complete return to the origin. And this is also the case within physics. Space itself is constructed that way. Now, while the Möbius strip does generally provide us with an appropriately dynamic and paradoxical model of the who-to double cycle, the specific phase structures of the Möbius does not meet the requirements of the who-to. This observation ties in with the proposition I offered above. It is the Klein bottle that is required for the full embodiment of the who-to archetypal field. what we will eventually see is that the lower dimensional Möbius structure properly embodies a lower order archetypal field. The limitation of the Möbius with respect to the who-to can readily be demonstrated. Again, a Möbius strip is produced simply by twisting one end of a narrow band of paper before joining it to the other end. If the continuously curved structure thus created is flattened out, we obtain the triangular version of the Möbius illustrated in figure 7. The flattening of the Möbius band gives its quantized structure. Instead of each cycle consisting of an unbroken revolution through 360 degrees. Now each is composed of distinct phases set off from one another by the creation of edges. For full correspondence to the who-to, we require 2 cycles of 4 phases each. What we have instead is a structure whose 2 cycles each consist of only 3 phases. To bring out the phase structure of the Kleinwürfel, we begin with the comparison. figure 8, construction of torus and Klein bottle.
So, figure 8. This is 8 torus.
Both rows on figure 8 depict the progressive closing of a tubular surface that initially is open. In the upper row, the end circles of the tube are joined in the conventional way. Brought together through the three-dimensional space outside the body of the tube to produce a torus. By contrast, the end circles in the lower row are superimposed from inside the body of the tube. An operation requiring the tube to pass through itself. This results in the formation of a Klein bottle. By comparing figure 8 with figure 9, we start to see how a quantized version of the Klein bottle can be produced. Figure 9. Construction of a flat torus. In figure 9, bar shows how a long paper cylinder, pictured at the top, can be flattened out along a dashed line. Then folded over so that the ends are facing each other. The ends can then be glued together to produce a flat version of the torus. Figure 10. Construction of a flat Klein bottle. Figure 10 illustrates the creation of a flat Klein bottle. Once again, the paper cylinder is flattened, but this time we cut a slit near the left end of the cylinder, indicated in the diagram by the dashed line. See middle step of figure 10. To complete the construction, we insert the right end into the slit, drawing it through so that it can be brought together with the left end from inside the body of the tube. Similar to what happens with the unflattened Klein bottle in figure 8. When its end circles are superimposed via self-intersection, the end to be inserted in the slit can be narrowed to allow it to fit. By flattening and folding the paper cylinder as we have, eight distinct surfaces have been created. These surfaces, distinguished from one another by the edges created in the folding, give the faces of the quantized Klein bottle. Which correspond in their number to the trigram phases of the Hu-2. But the one-sided Kleinian configuration is structured more subtly than its two-sided toroidal counterpart, whose four inside surfaces are categorically separated from the four surfaces on the outside. Let us attempt to clarify the Kleinian structure by opening up the folded paper model. figure 11. Opened Klein bottle. The folded paper model is open up to expose its 8 subsurfaces. Dashed lines indicate the placement of the slit, connecting the 2 sides of the bottle. Accompanying the Hutu number values are the correlated compass directions and trigram names given in the I Ching. The movement from one surface to another in cycle 1 marks the passage from inside to outside. These quantized transitions are shown as following the pattern of the Hutu cross. With the Hutu figure 2, action is directed from below North Kun to above South Chen. Thereby establishing the cross's vertical axis. Then, after moving down and to the left, East Lee, there is a transition to the right, West Kan. That lays down the horizontal axis, a movement that intersects the vertical. The self-intersection of the Hutu cross that climaxes in passing from the 3rd to 4th stages of action is mirrored on the Klein bottle. Its first 3 phases are followed by a 4th that brings its self-intersection. As indicated by the dashed line signifying the slit where the surface passes through itself. And in moving through the slit, we return to center. Whereupon we find ourselves ready to begin again in cycle 2 with phase 6. Though we are now beginning on the outside of the Klein bottle, note that unlike the other phases of cycle 1, phase 5 is associated neither with the compass direction nor a trigram. The 5th phase merely marks the completion of cycle 1 by returning us to our point of departure. Though now on the opposite side of the surface. And it is this quasi-return that prepares us for initiating the phase actions of cycle 2. I will draw something on the whiteboard. Can put a little pause there. So I will make a little summary here of what I just read. Let's check that I put in a point. Sorry. This affects how we make conclusions. In the West, for a long time, there's been a Gödelian structure, rules as it's perceived by the Western Hemisphere for making thinking, statements, propositions, all modes of concluding activities or judgments. This is especially pertinent for me myself. I remember many years ago I was in China and I wanted to look at our articles and propositions, and it was this professor from Peking University who went about with a red pencil and drew heavily on the first article because there was no initiation, no introduction. And then he became more flustered because there was no middle. And at the end he got confused because not even a conclusion was to be seen. I have to say, I've been befuddled to this day what he meant. But I realize now that I came equipped with a outside Gödel structure for how reason worked. Some sort of rules for reason that was transcendent and obviously not shared by the Chinese. And now I realized if it's not founded in the Kleinbottle logic, it will lack all validity. It will not be correct. So our way of thinking is following rather some perceived linearity, and you could also possibly term that the Newtonian paradigm. And this in contrast to the world as a process. The Hutu made that clear to me. It's a riddle that's been haunting my mind for decades now.
So that paper was written by Westerner.
And in the end what happened is all our papers came out and he did not even care to look at them. He just threw them to the side with a big red cross. We were using a Gödelian structure, and as proven by Gödel, such a structure can never lead to a conclusion, and it doesn't contain an initiation or an introduction, and there is no middle, because it is not following anything. It is sort of pointing to some sort of unshared transcendence. I was wondering, why didn't he care to read all of it? Why did he give it up? Well, he felt, or rather understood, that there was no system to them. The perceived system is oddly similar to the idea that Gödel had about mathematics, that it was outsidely ruled by something that he perceived to be meta, or if you prefer, transcendent, or why not otherworldly. Now I realize for a conclusion to be valid and possible to accept, or for it to have knowledgeable force, it needs to make a 360-degree turn to the origin. What we brought to Peking in 1993, 3 decades ago, was a subjective, random, transcendental system that could not be acknowledged as a system or as an ordered thinking. One of the words that erupted from another professor came to me, and it meant scattered. The illustration I got from that is comparing drawing a picture carefully or just taking the horn of ink and throwing it to the wall and get these fragmented, unordered things. And I realize now this is also a good tool to get closer to the possibly one exception, at least in ancient times, to this random, unregulated or non-valid thinking, and that was Heraclitus himself. And why? Possibly using some ancient Gödelian structure, or at least transcendental, otherworldly, emotional perception. What helped with my understanding here is, of course, the private language argument. We all came to China with our own private language arguments. And there is a sour awareness that I did not even understand it myself. There cannot be an unshared meta rule for how conclusions are made. In what hemisphere would this exist? Outside the Platonic cave, obviously, but it is not of this world. It is strictly otherworldly in the most definite sense, meaning it doesn't have any validity in our world. Maybe there's a question here.
Okay.
A little something from my colleague Kelly here.
Hello, hello. Let me use the pen. How do I put this on? This?
Yeah. Be careful not to pinch yourself. There you go, mate.
Thank you.
So in the paper,
May I?
Yes.
Okay, I already began. There were 4 references to Hezekiel, the Old Testament prophet. And in Ezekiel chapter 1 is famous because you have the 4 living creatures. These 4 living creatures represent in Christian tradition the 4 evangelists. And so the creature which has the human face represents Matthew, because Matthew begins with the human genealogy of Jesus. And then you have a lion that represents Mark, and an ox that represents Luke, and an eagle represents John. But now I will focus on one verse. It says in English translation, a wheel in the middle of a wheel. And this is using the same word twice. We would probably say pivot. That's probably what they mean. Okay, we don't know what or if it's another wheel, or if it's only a poetic way of saying pivot. I don't know. And that's perhaps it's ambiguous, and I will also write for the fun of it also the Hebrew word for wheel. It can be fun sometimes. It's a little bit Hebrew. Wait, excuse me. Open. Open. Let me see. Open. And if you want the transliteration, open. Open. The read from right. Open. And I was thinking about, we have actually a gigantic wheel here. Hans, Look up there.
Oh, yeah.
This is Liseberg in Gothenburg, and it made me think about this wheel. It's not like a Möbius band. We don't have, unfortunately, a Möbius band in the nature. But we have a wheel, a pivot there also in the middle. That's our a pleasure park, and also a dinosaur there. So my point, I would also like to show you something. Raphael, the great painter Raphael, he actually painted. This painting is in Florence, in Palazzo Pitti. You have this. You see, God, angels, and the four creatures. You have there the person with the human face. That is Matthew. I think that is the lion, Mark,
Yes.
ox, and the eagle. Let me see, how can I make it clearer? Yes, now. And so again, man, human face, Matthew, the lion. And what about the wheel? So we have to. Raphael took some artistic liberty, so there is not a traditional wheel there. So it's instead the four living creatures, or let's say the eagle's one wing is kind of a wheel, if I can see it correctly in this picture. Don't think, or does it have a wheel? Difficult to say. Or it could be at the wing of the ox that becomes a wheel. So some artistic liberty. Or also perhaps the cloud is also a kind of a wheel. Don't think, perhaps.
Yes.
Yes, indeed. So
It's round.
okay, yes, it's a artistic liberty, but I think it's a nice representation to give a visual representation of the Rosen's paper. So is this a Möbius band? Not really, but everything, or perhaps they are. Everything interconnects, goes into another. He interpreted Möbius band very freely, and that was, I think, my small reflection. Do you want to continue? Put a break, perhaps, or
Yes, I have one comment.
yes, please.
And that is that the trigram is how things are structured, and I know also an example from religion, as Kalle took up here, that the Western trigram, the Trinity, already in the 18th century, 3 in 1, 1 in 3, became the very proof against religion. And during the following century, the 19th century, the song 1 in 3 and 3 in 1, the psalm, the hymn, became a sort of complete contradiction to all belief. So I think Kalle is absolutely right. The ancient had an understanding of what builds up the world. And in the post-Newtonian, it didn't make sense. So what was the essence of religion, understanding and knowledge became the antipode of knowing. But we here see that they did not have a point. And even worse, they did not share a point. I think that could be the most demeaning thing. They were random shots coming from different directions that, sadly enough, the people doing the shots did not even understand themselves. I can imagine it was a general feeling, and it's a snug feeling. You get, I had it myself, but you get to believe you're on top of the world, The experience in China left us all very lonely. It felt a bit that we were individually, isolatedly put on a pillar high above the ground. And even to make things worse, it felt that, well, to make parallel to modern Western philosophers, Putnam, Searle, we were brains in vats, or brain in a vat, the body, the trigram of reality, and the Möbius strip of what is actually working and of the real was far, far away. I will continue the reading here. That ends my comment, and
It's only 1 hour 32 minutes, so
thank you.
only one paragraph perhaps.
And I am now on page 18, the second paragraph. I want to emphasize that the Klein bottle is indeed one-sided. This means that inside and outside are not strictly separated from each other as with a two-sided torus. But flew into each other in accordance with the bottle's own internal structure. And I think that's important, that internality, the endogenous factors must be there for the thing to conclude itself. It is a double circle. It is like the wheel going back on itself, having another wheel casted directly at the hub. So cycle 1 does not consist of transitions between subsurfaces, all of which simply lie on the outside of the Klein bottle. Instead, movement from surface to surface entails a progressive passage from inside to outside that takes place quite naturally, reaching its culmination with the phase 5 completion of cycle 1. It is perhaps easier to see the effect of one-sidedness with a continuous action on the Möbius strips shown in figures 5b and 6b. Starting from any point on the Möbius, a revolution of 360 degrees will bring us back to the place where we began. In parenthesis, we return to center. But on the opposite side of the strip. We have observed as well that Möbius revolution changes clockwise, transforming counterclockwise action into clockwise action, and vice versa. The same applies to action on the Klein bottle. However, even though clock sense changes in cycle 1, we can still associate the overall direction of movement in this cycle with clockwise, given that the momentum is shifting through an initial counterclockwise spinning to a clockwise one. Cycle 1 can thus be said to involve the generation of clockwise action. In relating the quantized Klein bottle to the I Ching, we identify the 4 specific phases of the cycle 1 shift to clockwise as the cardinal compass directions of the Hu Tu. North, south, east, and west. Cycle 2 reverses the momentum established in cycle 1. Beginning with phase 6, our trajectory now takes us from outside to inside, and from clockwise to counterclockwise. In view of the way clock sense shifts over the course of this cycle, we can say that the cycle involves the generation of counterclockwise action. Relating to the I Ching, the 4 phases of cycle 2 are identified as the intercardinal Hu Tu directions: northwest, southeast, northeast, and southwest. Note, however, that in section 8, an alternative interpretation of phases of cycle 2 is offered that departs from I Ching tradition. Before going any further, I want to clarify the nature of the rotational action we are dealing with. First of all, Figure 6 shows the relative simplicity of cylindrical action. When compared with the action of the movies 6B. In the former, the left-facing profile merely revolves around the length of the ring, whereas in the latter it also rotates about its own axis. The same combination of rotational components, longitudinal and transverse, is found with Kleinian rotation. It is the transverse component of this topological action that transforms left-right orientation and clock sense. In the case of the action portrayed in Figure 11, jumping from one numbered face surface to another around the cross is the quantized counterpart of continuous longitudinal revolution on the Kleinbockel. The corresponding Ho-to diagram, shown only in terms of its numerical sequence, shows only this longitudinal component. But when we consider the accompanying trigrams and their compass directions, the transverse component of Kleinian action becomes implicated with the four directions symbolizing four discrete states in the hidden topology of the Ho-to steps. Ho-to helps us see more clearly how the Ho-to diagram per se and the pulsating trigrams of the I Ching are aspects of the same dynamic structure. Put a little pause there. So what this implies is, when we came to the East, we thought that the idea of reading or understanding had a rule in our system, and that it started with the top row went to the middle row and down to the concluding row. Rosen shows this to be an arbitrary and random idea, not a rule following. Arguments in the Chinese way, I understood, are correct, both from the bottom to the top, to the left and to the right in this system, but even more so in the cardinal directions and the northeast, the southeast goes inward as well. And this is astonishing. Let me just repeat it. Our take was a randomized, personalized, not really understandable, what we could possibly call an order, turning out to be without order, because the Klein bottle, as eloquently shown here by Stephen Rosen, is a double Möbius strip. First one made counterclockwise and the second one made clockwise, folded or gilded together to make a Klein bottle in completion. This is the true order of things. I was shown what they used as syllogisms, and they always went from bottom to top, but also from top to bottom, and from left to right, and from right to left. Even though there were a custom accepted going from left to right, the understanding how space was, and that this is not really a rule following. It is haphazardous, it's random, arbitrary. It is the belief of a rule. But this is the true order of space. And I think that our arguments lack that understanding. To them, it only looked like those ink spots on a wall. There wasn't even sense enough to criticize them, because you need to follow an order to have something that can be either approved or criticized. We didn't do neither. This is pointing to the true nature of all order, because in the ordinal number comes time, and space itself contains a movement, the original movement, and following that will make your arguments conclusive, valid, or correct. There will be correct judgments. I also have to add a little thing I noted. Terence Deacon is also using a wheel to show why absence is not only what surrounds a thing, in this sense, a surrounding area, but it is also, more importantly, what constitutes a wheel or any object. without the distance in the hub or between the strings, there will be no wheel. The spokes need to have air, and that air is measured, and this is how you do a wheel. It goes to show what we perceive to be empty space only in some cases is empty space. In other cases, it doesn't even make sense. Maybe a little question.
Thank you. Hello. So let me make my understanding so far. If I make, I will. Excuse me. Can you? Let me draw the Western compass. So we have the Western. It's not very circular, but let's see the Western. So we have north here and south here. So far so good, and the west and the east. So this is our Western compass, okay? And the east, so we can also have north here, if I understand correctly, Hans. It can be so, but so for us it's fixated. But for them, it's more like a wheel, so that this can be. It's like a fortune wheel that you have in a, let's say, in an amusement park. So like it can go like that.
It contains movement, yeah.
It contains movement. So you can find the north here too, of course. And I was thinking about, I like homonyms, but how wheel, is it a homonym with heel? No, it's not completely, but almost. But let's imagine for the sake of this. But I think it's let's say almost homonyms. But this is probably a more healthier way of understanding reality. And yes, I think it's good to get away from the Western rigidness of understanding, as if north is something absolute, while it is not. Yet the Easterners still have a better sense of direction. They know where the northeast and southeast, while we cannot say where is the north.
Yeah, good point.
Then I leave it back to you for you to solve. I don't have any questions, but perhaps you could say something about compass, how in the East they also have the compass, but I don't know if you know anything about the compass, the Eastern compass.
Well, what I do know, which I can talk about, is that I have a very clear sense of where is north and south or west when you ask questions. And I think that was present by any Chinese in Peking at that time. And I think it's important to know those things, because this is how we orient ourselves. This is how we know where we are. And those directions will be diminished by the fixated idea of the compass, that it's constantly in one direction. Myself, I managed to soften up that conception. So at the end of my stay, I became easier for myself to localize myself. Whereas the professor was actually carrying a compass which was ridiculous, and of course that took him away from the reality where he was at, adding an external law for the direction. So there was always a lag. It was 1 second to look at the compass, whereas the Chinese were directly there, without hesitance. And maybe that could be a good metaphor for Western contra Eastern thinking. I say thank you very much, and I conclude here. Have a very pleasant afternoon it is.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.